Thank you for using Engines of Mischief. This video is the second in a three-part series intended to help instructors understand the game. It especially explains the accounting that students must do in the marketplace section of the game. More information about the game and about the accounting in it can be found in the instructor's manual on the Reacting to the Past Consortium website. Don't forget that unlike other Reacting to the Past games, there are two essential parts to Engines of Mischief. Town Hall is very much like other games. Players are trying to get laws passed that help them. There's a student player in charge of the proceedings, speeches are given, there are debates, and there is a vote. Marketplace is where economic transactions and group actions take place. Individuals change jobs, improve businesses, open factories, invest. Members of the same profession and social class also work together to advance their economic interests and what they believe is good for the nation as a whole. Marketplace requires that student players keep track of their income and social status on two worksheets. One of them is a make money worksheet for the different professions in the games, like merchants, craftsmen, weavers and spinsters, editors, the cotton broker, and vicars. The other worksheets are the lifestyle and social class worksheets, and there are three of those for each social class: the working class, middle classes, and upper classes. These classes reflect the social hierarchy of the period. A few very wealthy people are at the top, but most with less income are beneath them. In the game, there are three levels within each social class, and which player belongs to which level is determined by the amount of income they earn. They have to earn the minimum income of a social class level to be part of it. The amount of money characters make in the game is roughly historically accurate because it's derived from an advice book of the time, although a few liberties can be taken. But in the game, players can move up or down between the class levels based on how much money they make. The goal, of course, is to move up the social ladder. Here are examples of the various Make Money worksheets. Each one has one or more projects players must complete to earn income. This differs according to the different professions of the characters, because each profession makes money in a different way. Their main projects are indicated at the top of the worksheet, although they are able to make money in a few other ways. So, for example, aristocrats collect rent on land and warehouses. Merchants run a textile production business. Weavers and spinsters make the actual physical cloth. Here are some of the other professions. All these characters may not appear in every instance of the game. It depends on the number of students in the course. See the role allocation table in the instructor's manual for which characters to include for the number of students in the class. Here are a few more professions. These worksheets can be printed out and distributed to students who can fill them out by hand. There are 10 worksheets in all, but in smaller games, fewer will be needed. These also are available as fillable PDFs. These can be filled in on a phone or a computer. They do require an Adobe Reader program, but the free version works fine. The fillable PDFs are especially good for merchants and craftsmen who run businesses because they do the mathematical calculations automatically. So players can see what happens to their income and business in various different scenarios, so they can model business changes and other results before making any decisions. Here are the Determine and Lifestyle Status worksheets. There are three of them, one for each of the social classes: the working classes, the middle classes, and the upper classes. The pictures on the right are intended to give students a more concrete sense of what their lifestyle might be like. There are some prices on them, but students don't actually have to buy any of the things pictured here. It is intended to help them understand how differently the various classes lived. They also will see that the poor and the working class had very little in terms of food and comforts, while the upper classes were extremely wealthy. This should show the students that the social hierarchy was extremely unfair at this time period, but it's also intended to encourage them to aspire to raise themselves in the social hierarchy. So starting the game, our weavers and spinsters are at level 2 in the working class, the respectable working class. Craftsmen are at level 4 in the lower middle classes. The merchants are at level 5 in the middle classes. And our aristocrats are at all 3 levels in the upper classes. Trafford and Mosley are squires at level 7. Melbourne and Keeldar are patricians at level 8. And Lord Derby is a magnate at level 9. Everyone should aspire to move up a class level, so weavers and spinsters should want to move to the labor aristocracy. Craftsmen would like to move to the middle classes, perhaps to the upper middle classes. Merchants would like to move to the upper middle classes as well, but there's a possibility they could move into the upper classes with the aristocrats. And all of the aristocrats should want to move further up in that social hierarchy. Now I will go over some examples of what students must do to fill out their worksheets. Don't forget there are videos for the students for all the professions describing this in more detail. The links to them are on the Reacting to the Past Consortium website. They are also on YouTube, and you can just search using the term Engines of Mischief in quotation marks. To determine how much money they make and to fill out their Make Money worksheets, players will need some additional numbers. And they get this on a market conditions board that the Game Master displays or hands out. And an example of this is on the Reacting to the Past Consortium website. The market conditions can change based on a number of things. Certain laws passed in town hall will change the market conditions, but also at the discretion of the game master to teach certain lessons, the market conditions can change. The instructor's manual explains how the game master can intervene in the market in much more detail. What this means is that these market conditions may need to be updated each session. There also is another video describing how various players' incomes will change if certain key laws are passed in town hall. For example, a repeal of the corn laws or changes to taxes. Certain players also will need other additional information, especially the merchants and weavers and spinsters. At the beginning of the game, each one of them is assigned as an employer or an employee. And to do these assignments, the game master will need the employer-employee chart that is in the instructor's manual. The reason for this chart is that it's necessary for each merchant to have 8 workers at the beginnings of the game. This is so that all players start out evenly with a similar income. And these workers are divided between weavers and spinsters. There has to be 2 of each. The weavers and spinsters work in a number of different cottages depending on the number of student players in the game. And this is to reinforce the idea that in-hand production was done at home in a cottage. So the premise of the game is that each student player lives in a cottage with either 1 or 3 other relatives. So there will be either 2 or 4 residents per cottage. Half of them will be weavers, half of them will be spinsters, because it does take 1 spinster and 1 weaver to produce a unit of cloth. But the student player is just 1 person in that cottage, and the other people are unseen relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers. The student player commands the labor of their relatives. So if the student player decides to change employers, or if they get paid a higher wage, or if they decide to join a factory, all the other residents in the cottage will go with them. And this makes clear that there were far more workers in Manchester at the time than the number of players in the game, but it also gives the weavers and spinsters in playing the game a little bit more power in relation to their employers. Again, this is on the Reacting to the Past Consortium website. The instructor can create a visual chart like this one to give students or to display, showing the cottages and the inhabitants. Again, this reinforces the idea that they are working from home, but it also gives them a sense of how many other players are there, and it gives those players names. Once again, this is on the Reacting to the Past Consortium website. If a student player changes employers, their entire cottage could be moved to another column. The column are the employers. If the workers decide to leave ham production at home and move to a factory, the cottages can be removed from this chart altogether, and the names of the players and their relatives placed on a factory roster. Now we will see some examples of what a number of different players have to do to fill out their worksheets each session. We'll have 3 examples: 1 spinster, 1 aristocrat, and 1 merchant. So here's our spinster. The first thing she has to do is write down her character's name at the top and the session number. This is Mary Cannon. Then she indicates what type of work she does. And all the spinsters and weavers begin the game in hand production, and this is session 1. So she writes the type of work there, hand or home production. She also will write the names of the cottage mates that she has, her name first, and then the other spinsters and weavers in her cottage that she got on the chart, the employer-employee chart previously given. And she puts her employer's name. Then she has to figure out how much money she's earned that session. All weavers and spinsters start out making a set wage. The employer comes to the cottage, picks up the finished cloth that was made last week, and pays a wage to the weaver or spinster, and then drops off raw cotton for next week. On the market conditions board is the average wage for hand production, which is 10 shillings, which Mary Cannon will put in the box there. This wage can change. This is just the market wage, and we're assuming in session 1 that the market wage is being used. We're also assuming that Mary Cannon in session 1 hasn't figured out any other ways to make money, so she will put 10 shillings down at the total. We're assuming she hasn't spent any money, so in the end she gets 10 shillings as her total income. She puts that at the bottom and then at the top, and she has no savings. So the next thing that Mary Cannon has to do is fill out her determined lifestyle and status worksheet for the working classes. And she will use the savings and income that she determined on her Make Money worksheet for the same session. Again, she's filling out only the boxes for the level she belongs to, level 2, of people who make between 10 and 24 shillings weekly. She makes 10 shillings. The first thing she does is fill out the weekly income boxes with her wage, 10 shillings, her savings, 0. She adds them up, and she has a total income of 10. The next thing she has to do is spend money on necessities. This is food, wardrobe and household items, and shelter. She has to spend a certain amount of money on those necessities to be considered a member of the respectable working classes and not the working poor. And in this case, she must spend 10 shillings on all of those things. What this means is that she has no extra money for luxuries. It would be great to buy luxuries because luxuries bring status. Luxuries show that this person can live better than other people at her social class level, and that gives them respect and status for doing well. But in her case, she needs to have 4 extra shillings in savings to be able to gain 1 status point, and Mary Cannon has nothing. So she, like all the other weavers and the spinsters in the game, ends session 1 with nothing, with no savings. So this should encourage them to try to find ways to earn more money so that they can buy some luxuries and they can earn some status. Let's move to the other end of the social hierarchy, and we get to the Earl of Derby. Again, he puts his name at the top, and he makes money by collecting rent. How much he gets for rent depends on the number of plots of land he has, and it's at the top. He has 20 plots of land more than anybody else. It also depends on the rent per plot. This again is at the top. It's also on the market conditions board. And all the aristocrats get 1,000 shillings per plot of land. And if you add that up, that means that the Earl of Derby's total rent collected on agricultural land is 20,000 shillings. He does have some warehouses that he can rent to merchants or craftsmen if they want to open a factory in them. But we're assuming in session 1 that he hasn't done that yet. So he includes his total money earned from rent, and assuming he hasn't earned any other money or spent any other money, he ends the session with 20,000 shillings. He does have a savings of 10,000 shillings also. He then fills in the boxes for his class level 9 magnates, and his income is 20 shillings, his savings 10 shillings, so he has a total income of 30,000 shillings. Again, he has to buy necessities. In this case, he must spend 20,000 shillings for every session on food, wardrobe, jewelry, a huge estate, servants, parties, things like that. But even with spending 20,000 shillings, he has 10,000 shillings left in savings. This means he can buy luxuries. If he spends 3,500 shillings on luxuries, he can gain 1 status point. He can actually, with 10,000 shillings, spend even 7,000 shillings on luxuries, and he has 3,000 shillings left over, but he gets 2 status points, which he puts in the yellow box to the left. He then adds up his status points in the row below. 2 status points he moves from up above, because those are lifestyle status points. He got them from buying luxuries. He could have made other status points, for example, in town hall, if he gave an excellent speech or if he wrote a really excellent newspaper article. If there were any status points from the last session, he'll put it in the next box, and then he adds it up. So in the end, the Earl of Derby, without doing anything in session 1, ends up with 3 status points and 3,000 shillings in savings. So if the other players, if Mary Cannon, for example, knew this, she would understand exactly how unfair the social hierarchy is. She ends session 1 with nothing, and the Earl of Derby ends with status points and savings. So let's look at another slightly more complicated worksheet, and this is from a merchant. Say it's Merchant Samuel Oldnow in session 1. He has to figure out how much money he's earned, and he's making most of his money from selling cloth. This depends on a number of things. First, it depends on the number of workers he employs, and as we know, in the beginning of the game, each merchant employs 8 workers. But it also depends on the productivity of those workers. In other words, how much cloth each worker produces. This is on the market conditions board. For hand production, the productivity is 1, so that's put in the box there. He then has to know how much he sells his finished cloth for at the market. Again, this is on the market conditions board. It's 100 shillings. So every unit of finished cloth earns the business owner 100 shillings. He adds that up, and he finds that he earns 800 shillings in cloth sales. He does have to spend some money to run his business. He has to buy some raw cotton. He has to know how much raw cotton is needed per worker. In this case, it's 1 unit per worker. He also has to know what the price of raw cotton is. In this case, it's 30 shillings. And the last thing he has to figure out is how much he's going to pay his workers. And again, on the market conditions board, in session 1, the wage is 10 shillings, so he's going to pay the market wage. Adding everything up in his totals, he makes 800 shillings in cloth sales. He hasn't gotten any other income. He has to spend 240 shillings on cotton, 80 shillings on wages. He has no other expenses. And when this is added up, he ends up with 480 shillings, He also has a savings of 100 shillings. This is indicated in his worksheet. So now we have to see how well he does, what his lifestyle is like with 100 shillings in savings and 480 shillings in income. Again, he fills out just the boxes for class level 5, and he includes his income and savings, so he has a total income of 580 shillings. His necessities are 450 shillings, which means he's left with 130 shillings after paying for necessities. He would like to buy luxuries, but unfortunately for him, people at his class level have to spend 345 shillings on luxuries to get a status point. So he doesn't get any status points, although he has some savings. So it's in his interest, again, to figure out how to make some more money. Here's an example of how he could make some more money in his hand production business. He could employ more workers. So instead of 8 workers, he could employ 12 workers. And as you can see, that means he's there making more cloth, he's selling more cloth and earning more income from his cloth sales. But also he's spending a little bit more money to make that cloth and cotton and wages. In the end, however, he ends up with 720 shillings in income, and he can keep his savings from last session of 130 shillings. And now he fills in his boxes. He has 850 shillings he can use. His necessities are 450 shillings, so he has 400 shillings left over. And now he can buy luxuries. He can buy 345 shillings of luxuries. He can get himself a status point. He does still have 55 shillings in savings, so he puts his status points down there and adds them up. So he could end up with 2 status points and 55 shillings in savings if he improved his hand production business. But he probably wants to open a factory because factories will produce much more money than hand production business. In their roll sheets for the merchants and craftsmen is a diagram about how to open a factory. It involves 2 steps, and this diagram is also on the Make Money worksheet. The first step is that a factory has to be built. In other words, the merchant has to buy a machine, get an agreement from an aristocrat to rent a warehouse in the next session to house the machines, and pay startup costs to open the factory. And then after the factory is opened, the session after it's built, it can be opened and operated, but this requires getting 8 workers and then paying for all the things that are needed to run the factory: cotton, wages, rent, and operating expenses. So here's an example of what it costs to open a factory. As it says here, there are startup costs and machines. So these must be paid for before the session, before the factory is opened. And how much this costs is on the market conditions board. A machine, the average price is 300 shillings. The merchant would have to negotiate with a craftsman, go talk to a craftsman, see if there's a machine to buy. He might have to pay more, he might be able to pay less, but it's around 300 shillings. And startup costs are 200 shillings. So it's around 500 shillings is necessary to build a factory. And then, of course, the session before operating the factory, the merchant probably wants to talk to an aristocrat to see if they can get an agreement to rent a warehouse. They don't have to pay the rent until they're operating the factory, but they probably should get the agreement before the factory. And again, the average price for warehouse rent is on the market conditions board, but again, it's negotiable. And then the merchant will have to get 8 workers. There's a minimum of 8 workers to work in the factory. So probably before operating the factory, he might want to talk to some of the weavers and spinsters in the game and see if they're willing to move to a factory. If he can't get existing weavers and spinsters, there is a possibility that there are Irish immigrants. The merchant would have to ask the game master about that. There may be some orphans, which either the game master or one of the vicars would have available to work in the factory. The merchant in hand production will have to build a factory before it's operational. And here's an example of how a merchant could use their hand production make money worksheet to open a factory. So this is the worksheet that we saw before with 8 workers, productivity of 1. What the merchant would do probably is have to get a loan. If it costs about 500 shillings to open a factory, to build a factory, most of the merchants don't have that much money in session 1 or session 2. So they would have to ask either the banker if they're in the game, or an aristocrat, or even the game master for a loan of 500 shillings, which they will have to pay interest on each subsequent session until they pay off the principal. Then the merchant can buy a machine and pay for startup costs in money spent with that loan. So in the end, they're spending 500 shillings to open a factory, but they have 500 extra shillings because of the loan. And in the end, they end up with the same amount of money that they did before, 480 shillings. So now this is what happens when the factory is actually operational. And this really does require the Market Conditions Board. So now we're operating a factory. The first thing the merchant has to do is say how many machines they have. They need at least 1 machine, but they can have more than 1 machine in a factory. And the more machines they have, the higher the productivity, but also the higher expenses in cotton and operating expenses. Then again, they put in the number of workers they have, the productivity, which is 5 for factories instead of 1 for hand production. The price of cloth is the same, 100 shillings. So he's making 4,000 shillings in cloth sales, which is quite a lot. He puts the number of workers in again for cloth. Units of raw cloth is 5, like productivity. The price is still 30, so spending much more on cotton. And then he has to pay wages. These are different for different types of workers, for men, women, children, immigrants, and orphans. So let's imagine he has 4 men and 4 women. The average wages are on the Market Conditions Board, but of course it's up to him. He can pay whatever he wants. So let's assume they're using the market wages. So you multiply the workers by the market wages to get the total wages you're paying. And then he does have to pay for his warehouse rent this session when he's operating the factory, and he does have to pay for operating expenses. And he also has to pay interest on the loan he took, the 500 shilling loan he took last session. And on the Market Conditions Board, it says how much interest he has to pay. In this case, it's 125 shillings. So he is spending quite a lot more money making the cloth, over 2,000 shillings, but he is making 4,000 shillings. So in the end, he does quite well, making 1,935 shillings. Now we have to see what that does to his lifestyle. And one of the first things you can see is that he automatically moves into the upper middle classes. So by opening a factory, this merchant has jumped up a class and moved from the middle classes to the upper middle classes. He has an income of over 2,000 shillings, but now he has to pay quite a bit more in necessities, because to live like an upper middle class person, you have to buy better clothes and have more servants and nicer food. He ends up with a savings, even though he has to spend more on necessities, but he can't buy any luxuries at this point. He would need 830 shillings of luxuries to get a status point. However, by moving up a class, he did earn 5 status points, which he puts in the yellow box there and in the yellow box for lifestyle. So opening a factory really considerably improves the conditions of merchants. And craftsmen can do this too. The only difference between craftsmen and merchants opening a factory is that craftsmen don't have to buy machines. They can make their own machines and just pay for machine parts. If the merchant does even better and makes more and more money from his factory, and there's many different ways you can make more money from the factory, the players will have to figure that out. It is possible to move from the middle classes up to the upper classes with the aristocrats. And if they do that, they will earn 10 status points. So it is, if a merchant or a craftsman opens a factory, they can still keep their earlier business, a hand production textile business for merchants, the machine making business for craftsmen. What they would do is fill out two make money worksheets and then add up the total income and put the total on one lifestyle and status worksheet. So it is possible for players to have two different businesses at the same time. Although it's most likely that merchants and craftsmen will want to shut down their previous business and just concentrate on factories. Again, there are YouTube videos for all the different professions explaining in more detail how to fill out their worksheets. There is much more detail in the instructor's manual for all of this, and this can be found on the Reacting Consortium website. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me by email at this address. And thank you for using Engines of Mischief.